everybody. Welcome back up to the Vinyl Attic. I took a week off because I had to get some dental surgery. I got a hole drilled into my jaw where they're going to put a dental implant, and it was not fun. But pain medications are awesome, so don't worry about me. I'll be okay. Hey, we're doing this thing that we're calling the 100 Albums That Matter. 100 albums that should be in your collection. They aren't the obvious choices. We're not going to talk about Sgt. Pepper's or Dark Side of the Moon. We're talking about albums that are kind of a little left of center that are also worth seeking out when you're going through the bins. And we're going to do a soundtrack, but not kind of your normal soundtrack. We're doing a soundtrack that is sort of quintessential 80s in ways that I wish it wasn't. We're talking about Eurythmics, the Eurythmics album, 1984 For the Love of Big Brother, which is the soundtrack to the 1984 album, 1984. Artist had taken on Orwell's famous 1949 novel, right here, and made it into a film. There was a film made in the 50s. And then in the 70s, David Bowie wanted to make a musical based on 1984, and he petitioned George Orwell's daughter to say, hey, I'm Ziggy Stardust. I want to do a musical version of your dad's dystopian novel 10 years before we get to the actual calendar date of 1984. She said, no, no, you can't do it, David Bowie. But he had recorded 3 songs for that ended up on 1974's Diamond Dogs album, which were 1984, We Love You, Big Brother, and We Are the Dead. So you get a little glimpse of what David Bowie's 1984 stage production would have been like through that. When we started to approach 1984, the year, people started getting a little nervous. You know, I mean, this is a novel about a totalitarian state, Oceania. Orwell based it on what he knew about Stalin's Soviet Union. Orwell himself was a socialist, but he wanted to push back against notions of living in an authoritarian state where freedom was completely limited. And so as we got closer, and I was a kid, you know, when we started talking about 1984 is coming, there started to be more and more awareness. Paul McCartney and Wings on the 1973 Band on the Run album have a song called 1985. No one was ever left alive in 1985. The Clash had sort of a countdown on one of their records from the late 70s about, 81, 82, 83, 84. And there was all this, anxiety about what happens when we hit 1984. And so there was a lot of, fear that, oh my gosh, we're actually achieving, because Orwell had written this novel not way off in the super future, like in the year 2525, but in the close enough future where these things could actually happen, because there was versions of this happening in other places in the world. Just like when The Handmaid's Tale came out, that was written about things that were actually happening in the world, like the Taliban and things like that. So Margaret Atwood and George Orwell kind of had a similar idea about, let's frame this dystopia in the near future so we can imagine that it's happening, so we can prevent it from happening. So there was all this, freaking out about it, and it was a big deal. I remember New Year's Eve 1983, I was 19 years old, thinking, yay, Happy New Year, but we're going into 1984. It was sort of balanced out by the fact that even Van Halen played with the idea on their album 1984, which is more about Panama than Oceania. There was this sort of need to figure out where we are in relation vis-a-vis Orwell's vision. Where is Reagan's America in relationship to Big Brother's Oceania? And so a film was commissioned and planned to be made to bring this book to life. And the Eurythmics were hired because they had this sort of out of left field hit in 1983 with the Sweet Dreams record that is such a brilliant record. It really defined new wave electronica in the early 80s. They made it onto MTV. Dave Stewart and Annie Lennox were kind of omnipresent in 1983, and this whole record, besides the single, is is just a beautiful sonic landscape that is timeless as well as being ultra modern. So they were hired to do the soundtrack for the movie, including the score, the music that would be played in the movie, and take the stories of Winston Smith and Julia and O'Brien and Room 101 and the Thought Police and Sex Crimes and put all that into song for this movie. The director, Michael Radford, was not into it. He was not into it. And part of it may have been that the Eurythmics had an album out in early 1984 called Touch Dance that didn't do very well. And there may have been some sentiment that ship has passed, that new wave thing. It doesn't fit into this dark, sepia-toned vision that Michael Radford wanted for the movie. And so maybe they were a little bit out of favor. So he commissioned his own score. So there's a completely different soundtrack from the director's version. So in fact, there's two versions of this movie. One that has some of the Eurythmics music in it, and one that has no music in it whatsoever. But what they did in this album is produce a kind of attempt to create this place out of time. So see if you can follow me here. Orwell starts writing this book in 1948. Comes out in 1949, but he's writing it in 1948, so he just flips the numbers around, 48, 84, because it's close enough in the future, right? So in doing a movie in 1984 that's about a 1948 version of 1984, so a past version of the future, you want something that's kind of dislocated, something that's futuristic, but also contemporary at the same time, because we're living in 1984 and 1984. This comes out in the fall of 1984, but November, I think, is when the soundtrack comes out. But it's also futuristic and dystopian because it's not about the present, it's about a past version of the present. You follow me? And now that it's, all these years in the past, I mean, my students, I've assigned this term for my intro students, are reading about this thing they're like, why are we reading something about the 80s? Like, they weren't even born, right? They're all born in the 21st century. So they're looking at a past version of the future that's also in the past. Because I find myself telling them, well, let me tell you what was going on. I mean, I'm essentially the same age as Julia in this book. I was 20 in 1984. Julia's probably 20 in this story. And so we can compare it. And the question was, at the time when the movie was made, how does Orwell's vision of the future version of 1984 and Reagan's America of 1984 match up? And of course, when we look really hard, we could find things. But we we would never imagine what was coming down the road. What Trump's America looks like in terms of 1984. In fact, the scrubbing of all the DEI and black history and women's history from federal websites, anything that's been put there to create a more robust picture of what the American story is gone right down the memory hole. And that was Winston Smith's job at the Ministry of Truth. He was to take the news that wasn't politically suited for the moment and rewrite it in newspeak and put that out and say, it's always been like this. We've always been at war with East Asia. And so the fake news becomes the real news, and we're certainly in a vision of that. Weren't Qatar and Saudi Arabia the bad guys? Yeah, they were last year, but now Saudi Arabia and Qatar are the good guys. What happened? We've always been at war with Eurasia. I mean, we're living in a very Orwellian moment, and one of the reasons I'm assigning this is I want students to be able to make that connection, that we are now reading this book as a monogram about present-day America. In fact, when I went to the bookstore, I thought I need a new copy of this book. I can't find my old copy of it. I hope they have it. It was sitting right in the front because guess what? It's the number one seller at the bookstore. Americans are going back and reading. Americans are reading books. Some Americans read books. Other people just TikTok. Are reading this because we are in this slide to totalitarianism in a very frightening way. So, in that sense, this album, which isn't streaming, I don't think it's streaming anywhere. I know it's not on Spotify. Becomes a new soundtrack from the past about an alternative future that was produced in the present of that future, 1984, that is now in the past, that's about our present. Does that make any sense? Like, this 1984 is now a soundtrack for 2025. There are now thought criminals. How dare you protest Gaza? You know, we're going to send you on a slow boat to El Salvador. I mean, we are in a moment where this is now frighteningly relevant. So this soundtrack is, prescient, I guess would be the word, apropos, but it really does what the Eurythmics intended, which is create this alternative universe, this world that you step into that's very gray, that's very miserable, where people are drinking this crappy Victory gin and afraid of their facial responses because it's going to be read as somehow being disloyal to Donald Trump, Big Brother. And, it's about these two rebels, Winston Smith and Julia. I mean, my favorite line in the book is that Winston and Julia have this little room above the shop where they meet for rendezvous, where there's no telescreen to watch them. And she's a little bit of a vixen, and she is secretly, as you have to be, rebelling. And Winston says, you only rebel below the waist. Because he's saying that she just likes to have sex with guys as a form of rebelling against the system. It's a cute little line in a very tragic love story. All right, I wanted to talk about this album. The follow-up album that came out the next year in 1985 was called Be Yourself Tonight, which was huge. Huge. Would I lie to you? Sisters Are Doing It For Themselves, where Annie sings with Aretha Franklin. That album dominated the airwaves, it dominated MTV, and all of a sudden the Eurythmics were the biggest thing since sliced cheese. But this one is like a little in-between interstitial moment that doesn't get the recognition. So I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to talk about it as a quintessential 80s record, but also being relevant to the historical moment that we're in. And as Winston says at the beginning of the book, if there's any hope, it lies with the proles. So to all you proles out there, we need you. We need you because Big Brother is getting super confident. And there's a lot of people that are disappearing. And, it's time to commit some sex crimes, people. I mean that in the Orwellian sense. I don't mean it in the sense of felonies. Although, who knows what's coming down the pike. All right, I want to talk about that. Next time, we're going to go back to some hip-hop. We need to talk about some hip-hop. We're talking about a monumental record that is so important. We're going to talk about Run DMC, Raising Hell, the album that essentially brought hip-hop to the masses. It made it okay for white kids. It was always okay, but it made it okay for white kids to all of a sudden become obsessed with rap music. We're going to talk about that next time. But for the moment, this book matters. It matters. I mean, it's not surprising that it's a bestseller again. Orwell matters. But the Eurythmics and being able to translate Orwell's dystopian vision into this piece of vinyl that is so creepy, but also so encompassing. I've been listening to it as I've been rereading the book. The Eurythmics matter. This album matters. Fighting against Big Brother matters. Down with Big Brother. And you matter. So let's talk about it.